Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host and author, Ron Ovitt. Today we're on Lesson 47. We're on Lesson 47 in our last series of the class, and that is Emotional Relearning. And we're on Part 2. Now, you've been with me for a long time, and some of this is going to be a little repeat because I really want us to understand it. You know, we've been talking about emotional relearning. And, you know, when we look at things, we say emotional recognition, right? We want to know when we're off the reservation, right? I mean, when things are really over emotional according to the event that we're in, then we know something's wrong. And this is all about, of course, emotional resilience. So we want to be able to regulate it. Why? Where, you know, we talked about the hand model, we tend to flip our lid. Well, we want to give time for the prefrontal cortex to come online and communicate to the limbic part of our brain. And what causes it in the first place? Well, a lot of it is based on the emotional learning that we've had. And so we want to learn to emotionally relearn what the truth is so we're not triggered. And I want to get into that a little bit more today. You know, I found that there was different kinds of learning as I studied. When we began, a lot of cognitive psychology had been coming out on the front when I was in graduate school, and it became quite the thing. And we talked about, you know, what do we know? How are we learning? It's the thoughts that cause us problems. And I don't disagree with that. But my point is that some of these thoughts aren't rational, they're emotional. And I always use the example of the person that is good looking and yet they feel they're ugly. How do you change that? That's an emotional belief. It doesn't make logical sense, but they believe it with all their what? Heart. It's an emotional learning, and they need to emotionally relearn. And so it's important that we know, you know, what are emotions? Now, Dr. Sarah McKay, an Oxford University educated neuroscientist, she's written a lot about this, and she says the ingredients of emotions are the physiological sensations we feel in our body. And we said that early on in this class, that what we recognize a lot of times is the sensations. The root word of emotion is to move. It gets us to move. The sensations get us to move. What do we see? What do we hear? What do we feel? What do we sense, right? And it gets us to move. And so that's one of the ingredients. Of course, the situation we're in causes that. The people we're with. Have you ever been in the same situation, yet you're with one group of people and you feel differently? You're with another group and you can feel totally different? You know, the people we're with. And of course, our own personal memories and our experiences have a lot to do with it. You know, emotions aren't universal. You know, three people can look at a beautiful cake and each have a different emotion, right? If one person had just finished eating, they may go, oh man, I don't feel like no cake. Another person loves cake and everything. They're all excited. Another one is, you know, doesn't want sugar. They're not into it. It just doesn't even tempt them. Different of reactions, right? Their own personal experiences. The language, of course. That we've learned that expresses what we're feeling a lot of times has a lot to do with it. Now, Lisa Feldman has been writing a lot about emotions. She's got a classic book out called How Emotions Are Made, and she has different beliefs. She says an emotion is your brain's creation of what your body's sensations mean. And it's in relationship to what's going on around you, right? She also says emotions are made up of ingredients as your body sensations, your life experiences, expectations, the people you're with, the situations, much what Dr. McKay was saying. And then she says we're the architects of our thinking and behavior. We're also the architects of our emotions. And that's kind of exciting. You know, we'll talk about childhood today, and a lot of the emotions that happen were a product of our childhood. But now that we're older, we have choices today, and we can be the architect of relearning emotionally, and that's an exciting place to be. And she says you can practice your emotions in advance of a situation by teaching your brain the most useful way to respond in a situation. You don't have to stay stuck. And she used an example. Actors do it all the time. The emotions that get expressed on the screen are a result of because they rehearsed it, right? They rehearsed it. And we can too influence how we feel about things as we look at it differently, and as we examine different ways of reacting. We can emotionally relearn what the truth is and change our emotional response. And so she says worry is repeating a thought over and over again, and you're practicing that thought. And with practice, it gets easier to experience that thought over time. And she says, just likewise, you can start practicing positive thoughts. And that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about the fact that it's learned behavior and we can emotionally relearn. But her point is well taken. It takes practice. It takes time. And that's why a lot of people go through this class the first year and then they come back and they take it a second time because they're having more experience, they're learning the principles better, and they have more application. And you know, you learn these things. These things are caught more than they're taught. But as you learn these principles and start practicing, it's like a piano. You don't sit down and learn the piano right away. Likewise, when we're going to change our emotions, it takes time. You know, we tend to think that learning a lot of times is only a logical, rational experience. And of course, that's how we were taught in school, right? We had to pass math, we had to pass science. But the fact is, we learn different ways. And as a child, we learned emotionally, we learned socially, and then we started learning rationally. And, you know, let me unpack that a little bit. The first part is like from birth up to about 7 years old, and that's where we learn emotionally. We learn emotionally, and that's in the prefrontal cortex, in what's the lower part, down in the orbital prefrontal cortex. What we do there is start to link our emotions to expectancy. You know, what are we expecting causes us to react a certain way. We emotionally learn. If a baby cries out for mother to come to its aid or to feed him and mother ignores that, soon the baby expects that there's going to be no response, and it cries and cries and finally becomes more sullen and almost like depressed, right? Yet if the baby gets a positive response, it cries out and is expecting what? To be fed and to be loved, and those things, they learn those things. They learn how gratifying some things are and how repugnant or fearful or miserable others are. And that expectancy then causes a plan of action, a response. And with repetition, it becomes an emotionally charged belief. And emotion then gets tied to a belief as we get older. Now, the orbital prefrontal cortex, that part of the prefrontal cortex, is where we learn false beliefs about ourselves and because of our emotional experiences. And so a person that believes, you know, I'm damaged goods or I'm unlovable is learned first emotionally. You can see it in their body. You can see it in an infant when they're scared or when they're sullen. And they learn it emotionally first. And there's a grid that I put in the paper for you to look at, and I encourage you to get the notes. If you don't have the notes, you can contact me at ron@empowerministry.org. That's ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to give them to you. But what this grid does is talks about the fact that there's a continuum of pleasantness and unpleasant, right? This continuum, things are very pleasant or they're unpleasant. And we either have low energy or we have high energy. And this is how infants in early childhood responds to things. Is it pleasant or not? Is it causing high energy or low energy? And you can look at the grid, but some of the examples, like a low energy pleasantness, low pleasantness. So you have low energy, low pleasantness. That would be things like being depressed or being pessimistic. Now, if it's more pleasant, it's on the high scale, it's high pleasant, but yet low energy, that would be kind of relaxed. satisfied. It's low energy but very pleasant. On the other hand, it could be high energy and unpleasant. And what would that be? Well, that would be panicked or anxious. Or it could be high energy and high pleasantness, and that would be exhilarated or thrilled. And there's many, many different emotions you can fit into the grid. And a lot of children start learning that way. It sets up a child to learn by association. Things are pleasurable, whether high energy or low energy, would be associated with pleasure and something to expect or seek out. Likewise, circumstances that cross that fine line from pleasantness to unpleasurable, those circumstances would be associated, but this time with something to be avoided. And last time we shared about how emotional learning works. First, there's an emotional experience. And then it's accompanied by an emotional feeling, and that causes an emotional belief, and then that belief has a perceived consequence, and then that consequence sets off an alarm. Now, we don't think of it in those stages, but when you can analyze an emotion, you'll see that that's how an emotion becomes an alarm. It goes through those things. And you can go back over the notes from last time and re-look at that. Well, in his book, The Biology of Belief, Dr. Bruce Lipton brought up a fascinating fact. And I've been trained in neurofeedback, and so it caught my attention. And he quoted a doctor who said, between birth and 2 years of age, the human brain predominantly operates at the lower EEG frequencies. And I thought that was very interesting. Now, what's that mean? It means that in those lower frequency, a person is more open to suggestion. It's more, it goes between like a dream state and an imaginative state. And look at children, right? They're full of imagination. The mud pie is a real pie. The teddy bear and with all the little teacups is a real party, right? And children they're just full of imagination. And they're also, though, full of suggestibility. And so when, trauma comes or they get, the parent acts out and they get angry, the child then thinks of it, not in terms of just a little thing, but a big thing. It can become exaggerated. I remember when I first was doing play therapy that I had a child there, and you give him toys, and we had a sandbox, and he's playing, and then all of a sudden he's doing a scenario with mom, dad, and the child did something, and all of a sudden he's just, whoa, 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 yelling at the child, and I'm looking, I'm going, what's going on? Because I knew the parents. I knew they weren't, Attila the Hun, but it dawned on me that a child has these exaggerated, extreme way of looking at it. Have you ever seen a child with a little cut on their finger? They don't know any better. All they know is it's not good to be cut. And they've heard and associated that a cut could be dangerous. You could die, right? And so my little grandson came to me and he had a little pinprick and there was a drop of blood and he's walking like this. And he's just screaming like he's going to die. And it was just a drop of blood, right? And so we see these exaggerated, and the child then takes these things in, and later it becomes more and more a part of how they look at themselves and they look at the world. And so those first 6 years of life are fundamentally important. They learn more quickly during those years than any other time, and they're at the height of their emotional learning. And so it's, emotional learning is important. And what do they end up believing about themselves? What freaks them out? What is going to cause some problems, right? And so, you can have good reactions and you can have negative reactions. And so a little child learns that the stove is hot. And they touch the stove and ouch, and it was that little red glow, but they can't distinguish. After a while, they don't even go near the whole stove, even if it was off. That's an overactivation of that amygdala, you see. And that's what happens. A lot of these things become exaggerated. Well, then the second type of learning is the social learning, and that's from 8 to about 11 years old. And that's now when they're in more of a social contact. They've learned primarily at home. They've learned from siblings and family and maybe extended family and maybe some outings, but they've learned a little bit about who they are in the world. And if they're starting to get that belief that people are, they're suspicious of people, they're not sure about people, there's certain looks on the face, certain tones of voice that really set off an alarm, then they go to school with those. And the proverbial child that just feels bad about themselves, they'll be walking down the hall kind of doing the shy thing, the walk of shame. And they know the popular kids, they're over there and they're having a good time. And so they're looking at the popular kids, and then they turn their head back and keeps walking. He looks again and he sees the one of them laughing, and they make eye contact, and he looks like this and he keeps walking a little faster. Who do you think he thinks they're laughing at? Well, they're laughing at him is what he assumes. And why? Because he's broken, damaged goods, no good. Whatever his assumptions were, they may not even be articulated in words yet. But he's socially reinforcing what he already emotionally learned. And this happens over and over and over. And it's hard then sometimes. That's where that person that feels they're ugly, that would have been reinforced over and over and over. And so that social learning just adds now to our emotional beliefs. Well, the good news is that some of these things can change. The same part of the brain that comes alive when we imagine and daydream and rehearse people's reactions with others, this is where we can make corrections to that past negative self-beliefs and trails. We can use that same part of the brain to change our emotional beliefs. And so that's good news. That's exciting news. And then we see the last part is this rational learning, or some call critical thinking. And that's between 12 and the prefrontal cortex keeps growing up to 22, 23, or I've even heard 25. And it just continues, where we can start to think more critically. It's where our executive functions come in. It's where we can start to change our mind. We can start thinking more rationally, and that's the good news. We can use that part of our brain now to come back and change some of these things that we believe. And why can we do that? Because of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is more recent development in our learning about the brain. It's only really come into vogue probably in the last 15, 20 years. Before that, people thought that, what we learned early childhood would stick with us for the rest of our life. I remember hearing that in undergrad school. And Donald Hebb created that famous saying in 1949 that what wires together fires together. And people added to that, and it sticks together. But we know now about the plasticity of the brain. The thing that caused things to wire and fire together was the plasticity of the brain. The thing that caused us to start believing these negative things about ourselves, that causes us to emotionally react, is a result of the plasticity of the brain. And the good news is that same plasticity can help us change it. It can help us change back. Brain plasticity, neuroplasticity is a term that refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt as a result of experience. It's the learning, though, that causes us trouble. If we learn something wrong, if the beliefs are wrong emotionally, socially it gets reinforced. Now we have negative beliefs about ourselves. We end up being a people pleaser, for example. Why? Because I can't afford anyone to be mad at me. It's someone not to like me. And it causes a reaction. That's where that alarm comes in that we talked about earlier. And so what we want to do is use neuroplasticity to help change these emotional beliefs. Annie Hopper, who works in the area of working with chemical sensitivities, which is a real hard thing to change, she attributes it to the fact that the amygdala is oversensitized. And she says the adaptive property of neuroplasticity can be used in a positive way. Trauma can result in limbic system impairment. The good news is that we can learn how to become aware of the unconscious reactions. That's what I call emotional recognition. Learn to consciously interrupt the negative limbic reaction. That's what I call emotional regulation. And eventually rewire the brain back to normal functioning, which is emotional relearning. And so, we can do that. Michael Masowitz, who's written a lot on chronic pain and the neuroplasticity principles there, he says this: neuroplastic transformation is the treatment that uses the basic principles of neuroplasticity to change brain pathways back to normal function and anatomy. To accomplish this, we use thoughts, images, sensations, memories, soothing emotions, movements, beliefs, and we harness the power of our brains. And so it's exciting what we can do with this neuroplasticity. We need to be able to change those emotions that are wrong, based on wrong beliefs. We need to emotionally relearn what the truth is about ourselves. And we can do that by using our thoughts, visualizing new ways, right? Using our images, read sensations, right? Reacting differently to the situation, working with our memories, and then, using our different beliefs. And so we can change. We don't have to be a victim of these negative beliefs that constantly plague us. And so the good news is that same plasticity that helped us learn can help us relearn. We know today that we can create new pathways. I was reading on neuroplasticity, and a big breakthrough came when a doctor was working with his father who had a stroke. And the conventional thing was he had a stroke on the right side of his brain, so his left side wasn't working. Conventional therapy was, well, you better get used to using your other hand, right? But instead, he tied down the other hand and forced the father to try to use the left side of his body. Now, it was horrible. He wasn't able to do it at first, and he was a beloved person in the village there, the community, and so people were really upset at the son. But he had a theory that this would work, and sure enough, soon after, he was able to really start moving a little more, and pretty soon got back. Now, what happened, that part of the brain was dead, but the brain compensated by making new neuronal pathways, you see, and in other brain territory, and he was able to restore a lot of his functioning. Brain plasticity is really fascinating, and here's the good news, friends. We can emotionally relearn. And so read the notes again. If you don't have them, you can contact me at ron@empowerministry.org. I'll be happy to send them to you. Now, I hope that today's lesson has just helped you understand how, we've emotionally learned and how we can emotionally relearn. Now, next time, we're going to talk more about our thoughts. How do we change some of the thoughts? Some of the thoughts are just based on lies, and we might be able to change that and then have what we called last week an aha experience, and that can be an emotional relearning. And then, we'll call that flipping the script, flipping the script. And then after that, we'll go back into the emotional relearning process. We'll be talking about how do we go to our memories, where these things first started, and change the perceptions and the predictions and the beliefs that are erroneous in those memories. So stick with us. These are exciting lessons. I believe a lot of change can happen. So I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us today on this Emotional Resilience Living with the Fruit of the Spirit class. Please share this video with others. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of the other exciting classes. You can also, for books and videos and podcasts, you can go to our website, ronovitt.com, and find out more information.